Great. Thanks to everybody who's watching this video right now. This has been prepared in support of the town of Osoyoos's zoning bylaw update, which has been going on since 2022. There was a public meeting originally scheduled for July 23rd. Unfortunately, there was technical issues with the convening of that meeting. So this video has been prepared for anybody who is intending to attend that meeting but wasn't able to log in and is unable to attend any of the future meetings being proposed. So with that, I'm going to start into the presentation. There is some distinct subsections that have been prepared, and before I get into those, I'm just going to do a quick introduction. The town of Osoyoos contracts with the regional district for planning services at the moment, and my name is Christopher Garish. I'm the planning manager with the regional district, and I've been primarily involved with the zoning bylaw review for the town, and I'll be running you through the various slides today, which relate to some project context, some of the legislative changes that the town has to respond to with its new zoning bylaw, some other changes that are being proposed, and just some information at the end for people who might have questions following this presentation. So with that, I'll jump into the project context. And I always like to start these with just a really rough kind of flow chart showing the hierarchy of bylaws that relate to land use decisions within a municipality, whether it's the town of Osoyoos or obviously since we do a lot of work here at the regional district. So as you can see here, the principal guiding document would be the South Okanagan Regional Growth Strategy, which Osoyoos is a party to, and the town is designated as a primary growth area within the RGS. And so the town also has a efficient community plan, which recognizes that RGS designation and also speaks to a number of other land use priorities and objectives that council has within its municipal boundaries. And then in support of that, we have regulatory bylaws. First and foremost would be the zoning bylaw, which of course is the topic of discussion today. And then that's also supported by the subdivision and development servicing bylaw, which is just a reference. So in 2022, the town adopted its new official community plan, and the OCP identified a number of implementation projects to support the goals and objectives within the OCP, one of which was an update of the zoning bylaw. And in addition to an overall broader review of the zoning bylaw, the OCP also included a number of references to specific changes that should be enacted within the zoning bylaw if a new one was adopted. One of which I've referenced here in the PowerPoint, is increased flexibility around accessory dwellings in residential zones. Now, the town's current zoning bylaw was adopted in 1998. From what we can see, it's probably been amended about 150 times over the last 26 years. And, you know, honestly, when a bylaw has been amended that many times, you know, some of those changes can impact the effectiveness of the bylaw through the introduction of inconsistencies and conflicts. Another consideration too is that you know, 25 years, that's a long time ago, and the context within which the current bylaw was prepared was a slightly different time than the one we're in today. And so updates to ensure the bylaw reflects current trends and practices, and also to ensure that you know, inconsistencies or conflicts that have inadvertently been introduced are removed, and that you know, it's generally seen to be a contemporary document that's able to be easily used by the public and staff. So the project itself followed on, as I indicated earlier, from the adoption of the OCP in late 2022. There were originally two other components to the zoning bylaw project, one of which was also going to be a review of the foreshore and lake zoning bylaw that the town has applied to Osoyoos Lake. And then also it was going to look at the accommodation of short-term rentals within the town. However, because of recent legislative changes that were implemented by the province in late 2023, which I'll touch on in a bit, the scope of the project was changed earlier in 2024. Now going forward, it's a review of the zoning bylaw. It's now being proposed that the foreshore and lake zoning bylaw be rolled into the main zoning bylaw, and that the short-term rental review be pursued as a separate project to the zoning bylaw update. And so I know there's some interest in this other short-term rental review. That is a separate project, and there is information available on the town's website that speaks to that for those who are interested. Now, for everybody's benefit, I'm going to get into a quick overview of some of the significant legislative changes that the province has enacted and which have greatly impacted the town's zoning bylaw review. So again, some background on these changes. Housing affordability was raised as a significant issue in the 2017 provincial election. Local governments were subsequently identified by the province in 2018 as playing an important role in the affordability of housing across the province. And local government approval processes were further identified as a potential challenge to facilitating housing approval and housing construction. So the province undertook what it called its development approvals review process, and that was done between 2018 and 2019. There is a document online for those who are interested that goes into much further detail than I'll be able to here. Needless to say, though, the province did identify a number of I guess, aspects of the approval process that they felt could be improved upon. I've listed some of them here. In 2021, the first legislative changes to give effect to that development approval review process were implemented. Local governments were given a new delegation for issuing permits, public hearings were looked at, and changes were also implemented in relation to notification requirements. Second round of changes came in 2023, and these are the significant ones that we'll be discussing in the next few slides. I think of key significance for local governments, particularly Osoyoos, is the mandatory increases in residential densities that municipal zoning bylaws had to enact. And I'll just give a quick overview of those now. So the changes to the Local Government Act have identified what's now being called a restricted zone, quote unquote. And so a restricted zone under the Act is one where a local government has only allowed for a very limited number of dwelling units, primarily one. And so if a zone only allows for single family dwelling, only allows for a duplex and possibly a secondary suite or an accessory dwelling, it's deemed to be a restricted zone. And I think this helps give a little bit more context to what that means. And I've taken some screenshots here from the town's zoning bylaw to highlight restricted zones. And you can see here the ones that are highlighted, they're only allowing a single type of dwelling unit to occur. And even in the case of the R3 zone, yes, it's allowing for a two-family duplex, quote unquote, which is otherwise known as a duplex, but it's not providing flexibility in terms of people being able to have that two units be in alternate forms, right? So yes, you could have a duplex, that's two units, theoretically complies with the zoning, but it doesn't provide the flexibility in terms of people who might want to do one single detached dwelling unit with a suite, or one single detached dwelling unit with an accessory dwelling. So these are all examples of the restricted types of zones that the province wants local governments to move away from. And the legislation said that these zoning changes need to be implemented by June 30th of 2024 this year, and that they can be, depending on the nature of the municipality, in the form of a requirement for 2 dwelling units per parcel or 3 to 4. I'll touch on both of these aspects in the future slide here. But before I do so, I just wanted to explain first the 2 dwelling units. So that's across the board, all local governments, municipal, regional district, etc. Now, to provide more than 2 units, there's requirements that have to be met first. And so if 3 criteria are met, that local government has to provide 3 to 4 dwelling units per parcel. And so that criteria, as you can see here, is that the population is greater than 5,000. The lands are in a regional growth strategy urban containment boundary, and those lands are also serviced by local government water and sewage systems. And so when those criteria are met, again, the province is looking for flexibility from local governments in allowing those 3 to 4 dwelling units. So it's being recommended that the allowances be for either an apartment building where there could be 3 to 4 units, townhouses where there can be 3 to 4 units, duplexes with an allowance for secondary suites, which would allow for the property to meet that 3 to 4 units again, or similarly single detached dwellings with secondary suites and accessory dwelling units as permitted uses and density. Obviously, you're not going to get to 4 units in those situations, but you can easily get to 3 units. Now, going back to that, just to fill this out, if there's 5,000 people, if there's an RGS boundary, if there's water and sewer infrastructure, the important trigger for the difference between 3 to 4 is parcel size. And so the province is again mandated that if it's less than 280 square meters in parcel size, it's 3 units. If it's more than 280 square meters in parcel size, it's 4 units. Now, in the context of a soy use, just doing a quick evaluation of the existing uh, municipal context, we feel that this legislative requirement is probably going to affect almost all of the residentially zoned lands within the town. So I've referenced some acronyms here for the zones: R1, R2, R3, RSS, R5, and the RID zone will all be affected. There may be an exception for some of the parcels that were recently incorporated within the town's boundary along 87th Street. Because of the lack of municipal infrastructure, they may not be entitled to the 3 to 4 units, but they will certainly be entitled to the 2 units per parcel. So in addition to what is being called the mandatory requirements of the legislative changes, which is the 3 to 4 units per parcel or 2, depending on servicing, the legislative changes also said that if the minister releases applicable guidelines in relation to the implementation of the small-scale multi-unit housing legislative changes, that local governments have to consider those guidelines when they're making changes to their zoning bylaw. And so in December of last year, the minister did release the provincial policy manual and site standards, and these speak to recommended approaches to building types, density, setbacks, height, parcel coverage, vehicle parking, etc. And really what the province is looking for here is that the local governments introduce a favorable regulatory environment where hurdles or restrictions are removed, and that there's not limited, but that the approval process is as streamlined and as efficient as possible for housing going forward. And very recently, and I just put this in for context, I'm recording this on July 26th. On July 24th, the minister put out a letter to local governments just reminding them that, yes, there are the density requirements that need to be met, but that the ministry will also be looking to see how local governments have included the recommendations contained within the policy manual. Now, again, I've added this slide for context because in February of 2024, the province did announce that there was an option for local governments to seek an extension to the small-scale multi-unit housing implementation. Osoyoos has availed itself of that option and has submitted an application to the province requesting that an extension be granted, I believe, for a period of up to 5 years, so to 2029, in order to allow for upgrades to town water and town sewer to be implemented in order to allow the 3 to 4 unit density requirement. So the deadline for that submission was June 1st. We had hoped to hear by June 30th that the province was going to grant that extension request. But again, as of the recording of this video, the town has not received a decision from the province. So that will impact going forward how the draft zoning bylaw is structured for the residential zones. I'm just flagging that for people now because depending on the version of the draft bylaw you've looked at, you may have noticed that there's some notes under the residential zone section. That decision from the province will impact how that final zone looks. And sorry, I don't have more slides here to explain that better, but hopefully it makes sense. So with that legislative background context covered off now, the next set of slides I'm going to move into are explaining how the town is responding to that provincial direction on the implementation through the policy manual. And I'll go through this step by step. And I'll start with the flexibility component. And you can see here that in order to achieve this, it's being proposed to consolidate 6 existing residential zones down into a single new RS1 zone, which is being called the small-scale multi-unit residential. The provincial legislation does provide an exception for manufactured home parks. No requirements are needed in relation to that. So it's being proposed to carry that R4 zone pretty much forward unchanged into a new RSM zone. In terms of permitted uses within the new RS1 zone, you can see here it's quite different from the screenshots I had on the previous slide where I was showing restricted zones existing within the current bylaw. The new low-density residential zone is going to allow for a range of building types. It's proposed that apartment buildings, duplex dwellings, single detached dwellings, and townhouses be permitted. And you can see here another big change under accessory. There's clear references to accessory dwellings, which are detached standalone dwelling units, and secondary suites as being permitted use of secondary suites, obviously being incorporated within the footprint of a single detached dwelling, so not a standalone unit. In terms of meeting the provincial density requirements, the draft zoning bylaw incorporates the 200 square meter area directly into permitted density. And so again, depending on the parcel size of the property in question, if it's less than 280 square meters, then the maximum density is 3 units per parcel. If it exceeds 280 square meters, then the proposed density under the new zoning bylaw would be 4 units per hectare. And it is being proposed too to limit the number of single detached dwellings on a parcel to no more than 1. Now I've grabbed this particular image as well as some others on the following slides just from some random internet searches. I believe this proposal is from the Lower Mainland, but the reason I've included it on the slide here is because it does speak to the building envelope, at least visually speaks to the building envelope that will be resulting from the implementation of small-scale multi-unit housing regulations. And you can see here, this is a multi-unit structure juxtaposed against 2 single detached dwellings, more historical type low-density residential development on either side of it. And I'll stay on this slide for a second here. You can see the difference in terms of building height, obviously, but also I'd draw your attention to the location of the structure vis-a-vis the sidewalk and how much closer it is versus your traditional single detached dwelling. And I'll touch on that in a minute because, of course, there are some significant changes being proposed to setbacks within the town's zoning bylaw for residential development. And again, this is to create the flexibility and to ensure that the zoning allows, where permitted, the 3 to 4 units per parcel. The existing building envelope being height, parcel coverage, and setbacks in the town's current zoning bylaw probably wouldn't be sufficient to allow the mandatory 3 to 4 units that we have to allow now in the bylaw. So that's principally why changes are being made. So you can see here, and I've tried to show on the left column the current regulations versus the proposed on the right column, and recognizing that the proposal is seeking to consolidate 6 zones down into 1. That explains why there's a range of setbacks shown on the current column. It varies across the zones from a low of 3.5 to 6 meters for the front and a low of 1.5 to 6 meters in the rear. Side interior seems to be pretty standard at 1.5 meters, and exterior side ranges from 1.5 to 3 meters. The proposed RS1 zone setbacks are based on the provincial policy manual for an urban municipality. The recommendation in the policy manual is a 2-meter front setback, a 1.5 meter rear setback, 1.2 meters inside, and 3 meters on the exterior side. So you can see, particularly in relation to front, a little bit less so on rear, there are some significant changes coming as proposed to setbacks for principal structures. Similarly, identical setbacks proposed for accessory dwellings. So an accessory structure would be a workshop or garage, any other type of building that's detached from the house, not physically attached. So these setbacks would apply to those types of buildings. Building height, and again, keeping in mind the visual images here are just the result of random internet searches, just to provide some illustrative context. So they may not be precise, but hopefully they give a good sense of the changes. Again, building height, provincial recommendation is to go to 11 meters for a principal dwelling unit and 8 meters for a detached accessory, and that's what's proposed. And as you can see from the current zoning regs, that's significantly different in some zones where height currently is limited to 6 meters. In the other zones where it's 9 meters, the increase to 11 will allow generally for a 3rd story to be included on a new build. Recognizing that the RS1 zone is proposing to go to 11 meters, the town's current medium density zone only allows for a 10-meter height. So in order to provide some differentiation between the medium density zone and the low density residential zone, it's being proposed to increase the height in the RM1 zone to 15 meters from the current 9 to 10. So that should comfortably allow for 4 stories to be constructed where medium density is contemplated by the town's OCP and zoning bylaws. In terms of parcel coverage, this is slightly different than what's occurring at the moment. The current zoning bylaw doesn't actually specify parcel coverage. And you can see here in the image at right, parcel coverage is generally considered to be the footprint of all development on a parcel. And with the changes proposed to allow for 3 to 4 units per parcel, it's being proposed that a parcel coverage allowance of 45% be included into the zoning bylaw. For subdivision, again, you can see there's a current range across the 6 different zones. It goes from a low of 325 square meters to 835 square meters. The proposed RS1 zone is contemplating a minimum parcel size for subdivision of 1,000 square meters. I understand that there's been some questions about that already in relation to the draft bylaw. And I'll touch on this briefly, but the thinking is that historically, the town zoning bylaw, where 3 to 4 units have been required, has traditionally established a minimum parcel size of 1,000 square meters. And that's to ensure that there's sufficient space for the building itself, as well as vehicle parking. And so recognizing that, and also recognizing that the basic thrust of the changes to the act is to increase residential densities in established low density neighborhoods. Larger parcel size and preserving those to allow for greater density is seen to be beneficial as opposed to encouraging further fragmentation. Obviously, the concern being that the smaller the lot, the more likely it's only to be developed to one dwelling unit, possibly with a suite or an accessory dwelling. But if it's retained as a larger parcel, then there's more likelihood of it being developed to 3 to 4 units on that parcel. And we did some calculations based on existing parcels within the town, and so you can see here this is on the current zoning. I think the key column is the one far right. And I put asterisks on these numbers because, of course, these numbers presume perfect site efficiency in terms of subdivision. So that it doesn't recognize that there might be limitations either in terms of parcel dimensions, layout, easement, access, hazard lands, environmental values. None of those were considered in determining subdivision potential of existing parcels. So I would characterize these as very optimistic numbers. When real world considerations are taken into effect, I suspect the actual number of parcels that could be subdivided would be significantly less. Nevertheless, the calculation did show that there's current subdivision potential within the town for 431 new lots. I believe under the change in the proposed RS1 zone with 1,000 square meter minimum parcel size, that number reduces down to about 141 new parcels that can be created. And again, that 141, that's qualified as well. That again presumes perfect site efficiency, so the number might actually be somewhat less. Another change that's being proposed to the zoning bylaws to remove the current restriction on the size of a secondary suite. The current limit is 100 square meters. Prior to 2019, it was probably only about 90 square meters because this was also governed by a section of the building code. But the province removed that as a way to try to spur the development of more secondary suites in residential areas. And through the provincial policy manual, it's encouraging local governments to follow suit and to remove that floor area restriction. So the draft zoning bylaw is proposing to do just that. Again, on-site vehicle parking requirements. So you can see here that the table at the top is a screenshot from the current zoning bylaw, and it shows that single detached dwellings and duplexes are 2 parking spaces per unit. In light of provincial direction, we're proposing that be reduced to 1 space per single family duplex. Sorry, per single family dwelling, duplex, or accessory dwelling. Recognizing that that's just a floor. If a developer wanted to provide more when they're doing a new build, that's up to them. But the town is not going to require more than 1 space per dwelling unit. So that was the summary of the residential changes resulting from the provincial legislation. What follows next are a series of slides that speak to some of the other changes that are being proposed to the zoning bylaw. And I'm going to start with the definitions section. I mean, obviously, there's too many changes here to cover in the presentation. But at a very high level, I would just draw people's attention to the age of the bylaw that we're dealing with, which is over 25 years old, the fact that things have changed. And generally speaking, when drafting a bylaw, I think rather than being overly prescriptive in your approach to a definition or a use, providing, again, more flexibility is seen to be preferable. So I've given an example here where the current zoning bylaw provides a specific definition for arcade, and then lists arcade as permitted use in particular zones. Under the new bylaw, arcade would be considered as part of a suite of different yet similar uses classified under indoor recreation, and an indoor recreation would capture those types of uses within those zones that arcade or bingo hall or health and fitness centers are deemed to be appropriate uses. So that's one way in which the definitions are changing. The other is to try to tie them back specifically to uses allowed in specific zones to help reduce uncertainty or confusion around what does that particular use mean. We've tried to define each of the uses that are listed in the zones. And following on from that, speaking of uses, some other changes that are proposed. So the town's current bylaw treats cannabis sales as a standalone use and limits the range of zones that it can be permitted in. The new bylaw is proposing that cannabis just be treated as any other retail use, and where retail is a permitted use in the zone, then cannabis sales could be allowed to occur. Similarly, for cannabis production, it's being proposed to replace that with agriculture indoor. The benefit of this approach, of course, is that agriculture contemplates more than just cannabis production, and that would be allowed to occur within the industrial zone. So if there's indoor agriculture, whether it's lettuce or tomatoes or anything else that happens similar to the way cannabis production is done, that can occur in the industrial zone. I won't go into detail here, but the town has a very prescriptive approach to home occupations at the moment, and we're proposing to simplify that and to introduce a kind of a more streamlined approach to home occupations. And as part of that, it's being proposed to strip out bed and breakfast, introduce that as its own use and list it in zones as a permitted accessory use where appropriate. In order to ensure consistency with the town's business licensing bylaws, proposed to specifically list mobile vendors in the new zoning bylaw and to specify the zones in which they may operate. And then finally, some, again, more flexibility within the town center zone, which applies to Main Street and kind of the downtown core. If a property doesn't front Main Street, that flexibility be allowed to allow for residential uses on the ground floor. The current zoning bylaw limits ground floor in that zone to only commercial. Again, we're not mandating it has to be residential. We're not mandating it has to be commercial. It provides flexibility, and it's up to the property owner to decide how best to use that floor space. But on Main Street, that restriction around commercial will be retained. Another new provision being entered into the bylaw, just clarification around occupancy of an RV during construction. So I know it's not uncommon for people when they're building a new house to want to live on site for a variety of reasons, site security, proximity, saving obviously on potentially campground rates, etc. So in situations where a building permit has been issued for a new build for a house, there will be a limited accommodation made for people wishing to live in their RV while they build the new house. But obviously, once the house is completed, that provision would be extinguished, and they would be expected to move out of the RV and into the main house. Retaining walls, again, this is just to provide clarity. The current bylaw doesn't really speak to retaining walls, and it does cause some confusion sometimes as to how these are to be assessed. Are they fences? Are they accessory structures? New regulations are being proposed that will clarify how the town approaches the retaining walls and how they're to be considered and assessed. And you can see here on the diagram that generally speaking, a retaining wall shouldn't exceed a maximum height of 2 meters. The idea is to try to encourage a stepped back approach so that there's not monolithic walls being created potentially next to neighbors that could be adversely impacting the use of their property, or in other situations where a large wall may not be desirable. Waterfront facilities. So this is what we're dealing with here is a transition from the town's current foreshore and lake zoning bylaw regulations in that bylaw over into the zoning bylaw. So you can see here that there's some specifics about maximum surface area of docks and berths, the length of a dock, and the number of swimming platforms that can be put out in front of a property. All in all, we think that this provides clearer guidance, and from staff's perspective, we feel that there's certainly a benefit to only having to maintain one zoning bylaw as opposed to two. As I mentioned at the beginning, there's the main zoning bylaw that applies to land, And the town also has the current foreshore and lake zoning bylaw, which applies to the lake. One bylaw is certainly a better way to go. Some minor changes to the subdivision regulations. So it's proposing to create proposing to prohibit the creation of a hooked parcel. So for those who aren't familiar with what a hooked parcel is, it's one where there's two distinct parts of a parcel, and they're usually separated either by a road, a laneway, highway, etc. And I've tried to highlight an example up here, top right in the image. The other provision that's being proposed to introduce is limitations on the size of a panhandle parcel. And again, so for those who may not be familiar with what a panhandle is, it's where there's a very narrow access strip that leads to the back of the parcel where there's more land for development. And so the draft bylaw is proposing a minimum width of 8 meters and a maximum length of 20 meters. One of the main concerns with the panhandle is that it may inadvertently restrict the future redevelopment of the back part of the parcel by limiting the degree to which traffic can flow up and down the panhandle. So to address that, establish the minimum dimensions for it, so that hopefully in future, if these parcels are created, there's still reasonable access to the remainder of the land. Floodplain regulations, so some updates in relation to this. What can I touch on here? We think that the proposed regulations are going to be more consistent with provincial legislation that speak to what local governments have to do for floodplain and development within floodplains under the Local Government Act. There's a proposal to remove a 25% floor area exemption that we think has probably outlived its usefulness. And then also we just want to highlight too that these floodplain regs and the floodplain mapping, and you can see by the image, the floodplain mapping is fairly old. They are considered to be interim provisions. The town is currently in the process of updating its floodplain regulations through a separate review process, which we're anticipating to have hopefully completed by the end of the year. And when that process is done, we're anticipating that it's going to make specific recommendations to update even further the floodplain regs and the floodplain mapping in the zoning bylaw. So stay tuned for that project. And zoning bylaw parking requirements. It's this last slide here. So again, it's just how can I characterize it? Probably just about a general updating of the regulations. I've already touched on the changes being recommended by the province in relation to residential. For commercial, industrial uses, institutional uses, again, we've tried to tie them back to specific definitions and specific use classes in the zones, and generally try to get fairly consistent approaches to how parking requirements are then set out under the required number of spaces per use. Vacation rentals, and I know this is probably of some interest to people watching the video. This slide is just to highlight that in terms of the zoning bylaw update, we recognize that there are existing zones within the current bylaw that do allow for vacation rentals. I've listed them off here as the CR, CD5, CD6, CD7, CD9, and CD11 zones. We're proposing to transition those zones into the new bylaw through what we're calling the CT4 zone. And that CT4 zone is attempting to try to ensure that the allowance for vacation rentals is carried forward in as close a way as possible to what's existing under the current zone. But the intent of doing that is not to extend it to other parcels that don't currently have zoning that allows for vacation rentals. If there's going to be any changes to the way the town regulates vacation rentals, it's going to be resolved through the separate vacation rental review. And when that project is done, we're anticipating that there will be changes to the town's official community plan, zoning bylaw, and business licensing bylaw to reflect whatever directions come out of that separate project. So again, we appreciate the comments we're getting on vacation rentals, but we're encouraging people to please direct those to the other review processes going on. And yeah, stay tuned to see what recommendations come out of that. Getting near the end, I believe. Just a couple more slides to go on some of these other changes. So again, I mentioned at the beginning of the residential section how we're consolidating 6 zones down into one. There's some other similar types of consolidation being proposed. We're proposing to consolidate the industrial zones into a single new I1 zone. Not really consolidation, but proposing to reclassify the airport zone from its current commercial zoning into an institutional zoning. believe there's about 4 or 5 different zones that apply to Soyuz Lake at the moment, and those are spread between the 2 different zoning bylaws. So we're proposing to consolidate those down into 2. One would be a general zone across the whole of the lake, that part of the lake, obviously within the municipal boundaries, supplemented by a commercial marina zone that would be applied to the existing marina zones that already exist under the current foreshore bylaw. And then finally, proposing to transition almost all of the CD zones into other more established zones, whether that be a medium density residential zone or the town center zone or some other zoning. There is only one CD zone that's proposed to be retained, and that's because of some very complicated phasing requirements that were built into that zone that don't really lend themselves to any other zone that the town currently uses. Speaking of new zones, it is also proposed to introduce a new service commercial 1 zone to the existing gas stations within town, and that CS1 zone would be tailored specifically to gas station type uses, whether it's fuel, convenience stores, auto mechanic repair, etc. And finally, so this isn't really a change, but I just wanted to flag for people who might have been hoping or anticipating that there was going to be some changes being brought forward in relation to the campground zones within the town. We recognize at a staff level that there was a commitment made a number of years back to try to introduce or look at the regulations and zoning that apply to these campgrounds, and to do that as part of this zoning bylaw update. Unfortunately, just with the timing and the resources available and the requirements from the province in relation to the small-scale multi-unit housing, a decision was made that in order to get the bylaw done in as timely a fashion as possible, and we were hoping to try to meet that June 30th deadline, that the campground issue would have to be deferred. And so we haven't, I mean, we're aware that it needs to be addressed. It's not being addressed as part of the zoning bylaw update, but once the zoning bylaw update is done, we're anticipating later this year, maybe early next year, coming back to the campground issue and taking a look at the zonings and the regulations that apply to them and seeing what might need to be changed. And before I wrap up, just a couple of housekeeping items. So again, recognizing that this video is being recorded on July 26th, next steps involve in-person meetings by appointment, which will be, I think, occurring on July 31st and August 1st of 2024. Those will be at the town office with planning staff available to talk about people's specific properties and issues they might have. And based on the feedback that we receive from those meetings, as well as other feedback from residents who have concerns or issues or questions about the bylaw, we will be taking all of those to a tentative council meeting on August 8th to discuss with council and to seek direction as to next steps with regard to the zoning bylaw. And with that, I just want to put a plug in for the project page for anybody who wants more information, because we have put, I would suggest, a lot of background context and explanation in relation to the zoning bylaw up on the town's website. And so the quickest way to find that is to go to soyuz.ca, look for the council link, which I've highlighted with the red dashed line at the top of the screenshot. Let the drop-down menu appear, and then go down and look for the zoning bylaw update link at the bottom, which you can see in the other red dashed highlighted line. And with that, if this was a live meeting, I would turn it over to questions, but because it's a taped one, I'm encouraging anybody with questions to please reach out to town staff, and the best way to do that is by email, and I've included the town's email address there for anybody, and I'll close it with that, and I thank you for your time and listening to the presentation today.